Minnesota Vikings roster cuts, as well as every single other team in the NFL, have to get cut down to 53 players on Tuesday. And my wife and I were just having a conversation last night about the cut down day and, you know, the glamorous life of Justin Jefferson. And man, you think about the polar opposite life of guys that get cut every single year and are bouncing around the league, moving left and right. You're in Minnesota for 3 or 4 weeks for Minnesota Vikings training camp, and then you get cut, and then you get picked up by the Houston Texans. You're there for 2 weeks, then you get cut, then you get picked up by the Tennessee Titans. If you're married and you've got kids and that's your lifestyle and they're in school and you're moving them in and out, that is a rough lifestyle. So you think about these guys that are getting cut. You're going from 90 players to 53. That is 63, 73, 83. Almost 40 players on every single team getting cut. 32 NFL teams. 40 players on each team. That is a lot of players looking for jobs. And I get some of them make practice squads, and practice squad players make 6 figures a year, so that's pretty nice. Plus, you don't have the pressure of trying to play on Sunday, although you want to play on Sunday. I mean, that's the show. That's the big deal. You want to play. But practice squads are nice, too. But not everybody makes a practice squad. So, I don't know. It's just a rough life for some guys in the NFL trying to make a squad. American Underdog was on TV last night, and the Kurt Warner lifestyle of bouncing around, not having any money, playing in an arena football league, getting signed by the Green Bay Packers. Coach called him to go in the game. He said, I don't know the playbook yet. He got cut. So it's a rough life, man, for these guys. And they don't need me feeling bad for them. You don't need me feeling bad for them. But bouncing around jobs, traveling around the country just trying to find a job, it's not as glamorous as a Sunday with Justin Jefferson on your television screen. Those are just the highlights. But roster cuts are looming. Roster cuts are coming. And we could be surprised by some of them. According to beat reporters for the Minnesota Vikings, Dane Mitsutani, via the Purple Insider, he said that a cut that could be surprising is Minnesota Vikings cornerback, I don't know how to say his first name, Caleb Evans. Now, Evans was a part of the Minnesota Vikings 2022 stellar draft class. Let's just look at this Hall of Fame draft class. Pick 1, Lewis Seen. He's getting cut. Even though he had a breakout game versus the Cleveland Browns, he's getting cut or traded. Round 2, Andrew Booth Jr. He already got traded and got completely burned in a Dallas Cowboys preseason game. Pick 3, Ed Ingram in the second round. And he's been the starter. I don't know how quality of a starter he's been. Pick number 4, Brian Asamoah, round 3, linebacker. I think we all had high hopes for Brian Asamoah. I remember his rookie season, he was on special teams. He was probably on special teams last year too. But I remember everyone talking about this being the next guy for the Minnesota Vikings. Oh, this guy's a riser. He's coming up the ranks, and he's going to be a starting linebacker out of nowhere for the Minnesota Vikings. Then Ivan Pace Jr. came out of nowhere and took away his starting spot. He's a possible cut in training camp. Pick 4, Caleb Evans. Caleb Evans. Got it.
So you're telling me there's a chance?
Wrong one. Caleb Evans. I got it. Figured it out. Pick 5, Isezi Atomo. I don't think he's on the roster anymore. These are just fail after fail for the Minnesota Vikings. Ed Ingram's decent. Ty Chandler, round 5. Round 6, Vidarian Lowe. He's a household name for the Minnesota Vikings. Round 6, pick 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Pick 9, Jalen Naylor. He's on the roster. He's battled some injuries, but he's on the roster. And then the last pick is Nick Muse, who he's been a quality tight end for the Minnesota Vikings too. So out of all those players, the two most successful players were the last two picks of the Minnesota Vikings. And I guess the fourth to last pick, Ty Chandler. Ed Ingram's a starter. I guess he's the third pick, so I guess he's all right. But the 2022 draft class is a rough class for the Minnesota Vikings general manager, Kwesi Adolfo-Mensah. His first ever draft class is one of the worst draft class you could ever have in the history of NFL drafts. I mean, it's just awful. But the discussion is a Caleb Evans being cut on the Minnesota Vikings. And it makes sense because you look at the guys the Minnesota Vikings picked up. You got Shaq Griffin. You got Stephon Gilmore. Those guys are locks to play. You got Byron Murphy Jr. He's a lock to play. And then you think about the players that performed pretty well in preseason. You got Dwight McLaughlin, or however you say his name. He played pretty well in preseason, and he might be worthy of a spot. It doesn't appear that Duke Shelley's going to make a spot, even though he's a Minnesota Vikings fan favorite and had a successful year for the Minnesota Vikings a couple of years ago. But a Caleb Evans, he played most of preseason game number 3, which is why people are wondering if he is going to miss the final 53-man roster projection for the Minnesota Vikings, because how many quality players play in preseason game number 3? Let me make it easy for you. Zero players that are worthy of a roster spot most of the time, or that are guaranteed a roster spot, I should say, play in the last preseason game. It tells me that a Caleb Evans is on the hot seat for the Minnesota Vikings and could be a surprise cut for the Minnesota Vikings. So I agree with Dane Mitsutani's report that a Caleb Evans might be no longer on the Minnesota Vikings, which now adds another list to that 2022 NFL draft class that has been absolutely hot garbage to begin with. And maybe the Minnesota Vikings, since they lost a lot of draft picks trading back into the first round to get Dallas Turner, are trying to recoup some draft pick capital later on. So maybe they'll find a 5th round pick or a 6th round pick for a Caleb Evans somewhere in the NFL, somewhere. So they'll trade him to some team and they can get a late round pick for him. Maybe they'll do the same thing with Lucy. Maybe a team will take a gamble on him and try to get him. Most likely not that one. The Vikings will probably just have to cut him and some team will pick him up. But wow, that was a terrible draft class. And it just keeps on getting worse because it seems like a likely cut, and it seems like it would make sense with the veterans on the Minnesota Vikings roster and the guys already on the roster, players that have performed really well in preseason. I don't know if Evans is worthy. It's not like it was sensational last year. He hasn't been sensational in preseason. When's the guy going to jump out on the screen? He hasn't yet. So he might be gone. And the Minnesota Vikings might be scrounging around for NFL draft capital. So that's the guy to keep an eye on, as well as many others, because the cuts are happening Tuesday. So we'll all have an eye on Twitter and on social media to keep an eye out for what's going to happen after that day or on that day.